It is not dramatic. That is the first thing to understand about this. It is not the kind of feeling that announces itself with crisis or collapse. It is quieter than that, more constant, more background. It is a persistent underlying hum that something about you falls slightly short, that other people seem to have a quality of okayness with themselves that you have never quite located, that in any given room, on any given day, there is a version of you that would be acceptable, and then there is the actual you, which is somehow always slightly behind it. You have achieved things, probably significant things, and the achievements helped, briefly. For the length of the congratulations, maybe a little longer, there was a period where the gap felt smaller, where you felt temporarily like someone who had closed the distance between who you are and who you are supposed to be. And then the feeling settled back. The achievement became the baseline, and the gap opened again, just ahead of where you now stood, waiting for you to catch up to it, which you never quite do. This is the psychology of people who have never felt good enough, and it is one of the most common and most quietly devastating experiences a person can carry. Not because it makes life impossible, it doesn't. You function, you achieve, you maintain relationships and hold jobs, and move through the world in ways that look, from the outside, like competence and capability. But underneath all of it, in the register that only you have access to, there is this: the sense that who you are is not quite enough, and that the not quite enoughness is permanent, and that it is your fault. The feeling of not being good enough is not an accurate assessment. It is a conclusion that was drawn at a specific time, by a specific person, a child usually, from a specific set of experiences. And like all conclusions drawn in childhood, it was drawn with the tools available at the time, which were limited, which did not include the capacity to understand that the environment's assessment of you was not the same thing as the truth of you. For some people, it started with conditional love, a parent whose warmth and attention were tied, however subtly, to performance, who was more present when you succeeded and less present when you didn't, who communicated, without ever saying so directly, that you were valued for what you produced rather than for who you were. And the child, who is always trying to understand the rules of the environment they are in, drew the obvious conclusion that who I am is not sufficient, that what I do determines whether I am loved, and that therefore there is always a version of me that would be more lovable than the version that currently exists. For others, it started with criticism, not malicious, sometimes not even intentional, but consistent. The parent who always spotted the one mistake in the otherwise excellent work. The teacher whose feedback was always about what was missing rather than what was there. The family system where being told you had done well was rare enough to feel significant, where the baseline assumption was that improvement was always possible and pointing it out was the most useful thing an adult could do. And you internalized that baseline. You became your own most consistent critic. You learned to spot the mistake before anyone else could. You learned to discount the good and amplify the gap, because that was what you were taught looking at yourself meant. For others still, it came from comparison, a sibling who seemed to do things more easily, a peer group where someone always seemed to be ahead, a culture, a family culture, a school culture, a broader culture that communicated very clearly what enough looked like, and where you were positioned consistently on the insufficient side of it. And you accepted that positioning, not because you chose to, because you were a child in an environment that told you where you stood, and children believe what their environments tell them about themselves before they have the capacity to question it.
The not good enough feeling is a wound that looks like a fact. It does not feel like a conclusion that was reached by a limited mind in a specific context. It feels like the truth. It feels like an accurate reading of something real, and that is what makes it so hard to argue with. Because you are not arguing with a thought, you are arguing with something that feels like a direct perception of reality. And reality, as far as your nervous system is concerned, is not negotiable. It walks in before you do. That is the first thing. Every new situation, every room, every first impression is pre-processed through the filter of not good enough before you have any information about what this particular situation actually requires of you. You arrive already in deficit, already behind, already managing the gap between who you are and who the situation needs you to be, before the situation has even made its requirements clear. It makes compliments complicated. When someone tells you that you did something well, that you impressed them, that they value you, that what you contributed made a difference, there is a particular sequence that happens, a brief window where the compliment lands, and then the filter engages. And the filter says, they don't know the full picture. They haven't seen the parts that weren't good enough. They are being kind, or they are mistaken, or they're comparing you to a lower standard than the one you hold yourself to. And the compliment is quietly discounted, filed under temporary and conditional, and not quite evidence of what it would need to be evidence of. And you move on, holding the gap open, waiting for the moment when they see what you already know. It makes success feel like borrowed time. When things go well, when a project lands, when a relationship deepens, when you are recognized for something you did, there is often a quality of waiting beneath the success, a sense that the real assessment has not yet come in, that the good result is provisional, that the next thing will be the one that reveals the truth you have been managing, that you are one bad performance away from the environment finally agreeing with the verdict you have been carrying about yourself since before you can remember. It makes vulnerability almost impossible, because vulnerability requires showing the parts of you that are uncertain, incomplete, struggling. And for the person who already believes they are not enough, showing those parts feels like offering evidence for the prosecution, like confirming in the presence of another person the thing you have been most afraid is true. So you perform competence instead. You present the finished version. You let people see your successes and manage their access to your failures. And you remain, behind the performance, fundamentally unknown, safe from the specific confirmation you fear, and utterly alone in the thing you are most carrying. The not good enough feeling does not just shape how you feel about yourself. It shapes what you allow yourself to receive, what you allow yourself to risk, what you allow yourself to hope for. It sets a ceiling on your experience of your own life, not the dramatic ceiling of crisis, but the quiet ceiling of someone who is always managing the gap between who they are and who they believe they should be, rather than simply being who they are. Think about how you treat a mistake. Not a significant failure, an ordinary mistake. Something you got wrong, something you misjudged, something that did not go the way you intended. What happens in you when that occurs? How long does the response last? How large is the response relative to the size of the mistake? And would you respond the same way if someone you loved made the same mistake? Would you speak to them the way you speak to yourself in those moments? Would you hold it against them for as long? Think about the last genuine compliment you received, something specific and real from someone whose opinion you respect, and track what happened to it. Did you let it land? Did you hold it? Or did it move through you quickly, discounted by the filter before it could settle into anything that changed how you held yourself? And think about the voice, the one that runs the commentary, the one that notices the gap between what you did and what you should have done, the one that qualifies your successes and amplifies your failures, the one that tells you what other people must really think, what the situation really revealed, what the evidence really adds up to. Whose voice is that? How old is it? Where did it come from? Because it arrived before you were old enough to choose whether to believe it. It was handed to you by an environment that had its own reasons for offering it, and you have been running it as if it were your own ever since. That voice is not the truth. That voice is a conclusion drawn by a child from a limited set of experiences in a specific environment that no longer exists. It has been running in every environment since then, applying the same verdict regardless of the evidence available in the new environment. It has never been updated. It has never been asked to account for all the evidence that contradicts it. It is simply run. And you have simply believed it, because it has been there for so long that it stopped feeling like a voice and started feeling like the floor. You were enough then, even in the environment that told you otherwise, even in the moments where the message was clearest and the verdict seemed most certain. The child who received that verdict was enough, and the verdict was wrong, and the environment that delivered it was working from its own limitations rather than from an accurate reading of you. That is the first thing. Not an easy thing to receive, not something that changes the feeling immediately just by being said, but true. And saying it clearly matters, even if the feeling does not immediately follow. The feeling does not go away through argument. That is the frustrating thing about wounds that look like facts. You cannot think your way out of them. You cannot compile a list of your achievements and read it back to yourself until the gap closes. The feeling lives in the body and in the nervous system and in the patterns of response that were built before you had language. And it changes through experience, through the slow accumulation of evidence that contradicts the old verdict, through receiving care without immediately discounting it, through being seen in your uncertainty and finding that you are not rejected, through making a mistake and finding that the world does not confirm the worst version of what you feared, through showing up as you are, incompletely and imperfectly, and discovering that imperfect is enough for the people who actually matter. It changes through the relationship you build with the voice, not by silencing it. The voice does not silence, not entirely, not quickly, but by developing a different relationship to it, by learning to hear it and say, I know you, I know where you came from, I know what you were trying to protect me from, and I am choosing not to take your verdict as final today. That is not positive thinking, that is not affirmation. That is the slow, unglamorous, genuinely difficult work of deciding that the conclusion drawn by a child in a specific context is not the permanent truth of a person who has grown well beyond that context. You have never been not enough. You have been in environments that did not know how to reflect your enoughness back to you. That is a different thing, and the difference matters, because one of those things is a fact about you. The other is a fact about your history, and history, unlike character, does not have to define what comes next. The gap you have been trying to close has never been in you. It has been between you and the version of yourself you were told you should be, and you were allowed to stop trying to close it. You are allowed to simply be where you are, as you are, and let that be enough. Not as a consolation, as the truth it always was. Next episode, there is a person who cannot accept good things, not because they don't want them, because when good things arrive, a relationship that is going well, a period of genuine stability, something they have worked for finally working, there is a part of them that cannot quite settle into it, that keeps waiting for it to be taken away, that finds a way to undermine it before the taking away happens. The psychology of people who self-sabotage the moment things get good, where it comes from, and what it actually takes to stop. That one is next.